This happened around 15 or so years ago, when my grandfather passed away. In my culture, the dead are cremated, but first, there are elaborate ceremonies performed to honor them. The body is carried by our people while chanting the name of a Hindu god, Ram. After the body has been cleaned and clothed, ceremonial, colorful garments are put on it. I was never very close to my grandfather. I barely remember ever having much to talk about with him, but my parents say I used to talk to him a lot as a child. When he died, I didn't really know much about him, other than that he was the patriarch of the family, and everybody respected him. At the time of my grandfather's ceremony, I had just turned 10 years old and was supposed to stay at an aunt's house. Sneaky that I was, I managed to follow my mother when she left for my grandfather's house, unaware that I was a few steps behind her. When the ceremony started, there was a lot of crying. Soon enough, 4 people, including my father, my uncles, and someone I cannot now remember, carried the body on top of a structure made of bamboo and wood. They chanted the whole way, and still, nobody noticed that I was following them. Soon, they reached the cemetery. It was almost dusk. Sometime, in the midst of all this is happening, I became bored and I fell asleep on a nearby stone structure. Hours later, I woke up to the sight of flames burning through pieces of wood. I panicked. I looked around for any of my relatives, however. It seemed that everyone had left. I started running toward the pyre, hoping perhaps anyone could help me find my way out of the cemetery. Again, no one. I began to cry. I looked around to see if I was able to find my way to the street. The cemetery was on the outskirts of the town and it seemed so huge to my young mind, but I could not find the exit. Just rows after rows of memorials. It was almost fully dark and I could hear animals howling at a distance. During all of this, I began to feel like I was being watched. It sent a shiver down my spine, and I don't remember another time when I was more terrified. It was such a dark and nauseating feeling, a sense of impending doom almost. At this point, I was full-on sobbing and began to run. Little did I know that I was running deeper into the cemetery, farther from the road that would take me home. I reached the edge of the open ground and caught my breath near the tree line. I could hear faint voices coming from beyond the silhouette of the trees in front of me. Perhaps someone was returning after gathering wood from there. However, I was again hit with that uneasy feeling. I began walking in the direction of the voices, hopeful that it was someone who could help me. As I began walking, I could have sworn I heard footsteps, as if someone was right behind me. I turned around several times every few steps, yet found no one. I was so afraid I thought I might die. I decided to take a leap of faith and ran as fast as I could towards the trees. The sound of footsteps behind me grew louder and closer, and it seemed like whoever it was, they were near, almost at arm's length. It was like they could just reach out and catch a hold of me. At this point, I was shouting for help. There was barely any light outside at all, but I held on to hope that there were people in the distance. Suddenly, I was in a clearing, and there was a community pond with a bathing area. Relief rushed over me as I could see some of my relatives. Running toward them, I shouted and cried for their help, but I soon realized nothing was coming out of my mouth. It was as if my sounds were muted no matter how hard I tried. I began panicking even more, desperate to get to my family, to get to safety. As I ran, the sound of the invisible footsteps was so loud I couldn't hear anything else. My family members had their backs turned to me, so they didn't notice me approaching. I was almost to them when suddenly the deafening sound of the footsteps halted, and I felt a hand on my shoulder abruptly jolting me back. My body nearly froze on the spot as I faded out of consciousness. I then woke up to multiple concerned family members surrounding me. They said that they spotted me running toward them, and then I just stopped and fainted. I was sick for a week after that. I had nightmares for years. I stopped going to my grandfather's house or even into the town. To this day, I find it difficult sleeping in the dark and sometimes wake up in a cold sweat with the fading feeling of someone gripping my shoulder, like someone or something was holding on to me. My wife and I like to go on road trips to the Smoky Mountains. During this trip, We had visited the home of Sergeant York at Pall Mall in Tennessee and bought some wine at a local winery near there before going on to Gatlinburg late that night. Every hotel along the strip was full, and we were giving up hope when we came to the next to last one. We always fly by the seat of our pants on road trips, and I was beginning to think it backfired on us this time, and we would have to sleep miles out in a fleabag place. I was worried and tired. The River House Motor Lodge was just on the other side of the Pigeon River and long, lots of rooms. But when I went to the front desk, the high school-looking young man said there were none left. I was defeated looking, I'm sure. As I turned to leave, he hesitantly said, "Well, actually, there is one." Yes, anything," I told him. I was thinking it was some overpriced suite, but it was actually a decent price. He pulled the old-fashioned metal key down and gave it to me. I was so relieved, happy to pay. Room 237 was on the top floor a few rooms from the very end, and it was big. Double queens, a huge fireplace, and a balcony. The decor was 1970 desks, green shag carpet, Sears paintings, quilted coverlets. It looked like it hadn't been updated since the place was built. We ate cheese and drank wine on the balcony to the gurgle of the river. We even fed the trout with crackers and left cheese on the rail for squirrels, but it was early November and cold, so we went inside to sit on the large flat stone hearth in front of the fire. After 2 bottles of wine, it was only natural that we began to fall asleep in each other's arms. Just as I was going under, I felt the bed sink behind me, and my wife crawled against my back to spoon me from behind. She was ice cold. Did she come in from the balcony? I thought, confused. I had almost been asleep, but now I was wide awake. I was annoyed and about to begin grumbling about it. That was when I realized my wife was sound asleep, warm and curled up, in front of me. I was definitely fully awake now. I sat up and looked behind me, the area of the bed where I felt something was now empty. I stared into the shadows of the room. I got up and checked under the beds and in the bathroom as well as the lock on the door to make sure no one could have gotten in. It was locked. It had to have been a dream, I thought to myself. One of those lucid ones. I had never had one before, but I heard they seemed really real. After around 45 minutes of flickering firelight and wind noise outside, I drifted off to sleep again. I woke up an hour later, freezing. There was no cover on the bed. None. I looked to one side. Nothing. The other. Nothing. The end of the bed. Nothing. It had to be somewhere. I got up and searched the room, but it wasn't in there. I went into the bathroom. Nothing in there. I went over every corner and cabinet. I even unlocked and looked on the balcony and over the edge in case my wife had sleepwalked and thrown them over for some crazy reason. But nothing. All I could think to do was to go back inside and use the covers off the other bed. As I was walking to the unoccupied bed, I noticed that one corner of the missing comforter was peeking out from under the bed. It was stuffed under it. Why? How? My wife was solid asleep. I hadn't been able to wake her to even ask about it. I covered the bed again and crawled back into it. What else could I do but go back to sleep? It was 1 a.m. after all. An hour later, I awoke freezing again with no covers. This time I knew where to look, but that didn't exactly make me feel better. I got up again, annoyed, and quite spooked, of course. I made the bed as tight as I could. Hospital corners. The works. I stood there and decided that wasn't enough. I built the fire to a roar and stood in front of it. Not knowing what else to do, I said these words aloud. "I know you are lonely, but I have to get some sleep. I'm sorry, but I'm tired. I wish you peace." Hoping that would get the message across, I eased my way under the covers and slept through the night, undisturbed. The next morning, I told my wife about it. She was amazed she missed it all. I was just surprised that whatever it was, it listened to reason. The first apartment my ex-wife and I lived in was haunted. There were all sorts of little things that happened. silverware getting moved around, knickknacks on shelves getting pushed off. We could both feel that something was there, but it didn't seem malicious, so we never really worried about it. Then one night, something in the bedroom woke me up. I don't know if it was a noise or a touch or just the feeling that something was off. I opened my eyes and saw, well, I'm not sure exactly. The only way to describe it was something that looked like an old hag, just standing in the corner of the bedroom. I quickly tried to roll over to get to the nightstand drawer, but I couldn't move. I sat there and looked at it for what seemed like an hour, but this all happened in less than a minute. Then it suddenly ran toward me at full speed. I yelled out, but before it got to me, it vanished into thin air. After that, I was able to move again. I sat up in bed, still yelling at the top of my lungs. This, of course, woke the wife up. We talked about what I had seen and decided that our best course of action was to invite it to leave. So, there we are, middle of the night, standing on our little porch in the moonlight. Our door was open and we basically said, "We don't know who you are or why you are here, but we're asking you to leave our home. You don't need to be here anymore." Right about then, our next-door neighbor opened his front door and stepped out to smoke. He just about scared us to death. We surprised him as well. And just then, this strong, thick wind came blowing out of our apartment. It was cold enough that all three of us could see our breath in it. It blew for maybe 10, 20 seconds and then stopped. The neighbor, confused and weirded out as ever, asked, "What the hell was that?" I explained that we thought something was in our apartment and we had asked it to leave. Nothing happened in that place again for the next several months that we lived there. No idea what happened there to bring about the visit either. One of my closest friends growing up lived in a house that was, beyond a reasonable doubt, haunted. The house was definitely somewhere around a century old, or at least now it is, and our town was situated in a very woodsy suburb. He and every member of his family had reported having experiences there. Paranormal experiences? Several of our friends had encountered strange things as well, and I had my own too. Honestly, it would be impossible to try and condense it down into one experience, and I believe it's worth sharing the accounts I can remember. I'll start with the least scary one, which was thankfully my own. During high school, my parents went on a vacation, and for a few days I stayed at this particular house of my friend Steve. I stayed in Steve's room in a sleeping bag on the floor while he slept in his bed. One morning, I woke up to someone whispering in my ear, like directly into my ear, saying, "You need to leave, now." It did not say it super maliciously, almost like more of a warning. It definitely woke me up though, and immediately I was thinking Steve was messing with me, as he frequently did. But I turned around to my right, where he was sleeping, and realized he was completely out. "What?" I said to him, thinking he was joking around, pretending he was asleep. But he didn't react. He was definitely asleep. It was quiet, and still too early for even Steve's parents to be up. Then it hit me, as it still hits me today. I heard the whisper in my left ear, and Steve was on my right side. Steve had other experiences in that same room, a few I can remember off the top of my head. For a time he told me he suffered from sleep paralysis on a consistent basis. He would see distorted, demon-like figures in his room and would be completely unable to move. He told me that very frequently in his sleep, the standing fan by his bed would become a demon girl, and he would wake up with a jolt of adrenaline having punched or thrown the fan down to the ground. He told me he would sometimes see someone standing in the closet his bed faced, but he saw this sometimes when he was awake too. Oddly enough, his sleep paralysis significantly decreased as soon as he moved out of that place. That floor, the second floor where Steve, his parents, and 2 of his 4 sisters slept, was extremely creepy. I remember always getting weird feelings up there. One of his sisters claimed to see the ghost of a little boy in their bathroom. His mom once opened the closet in her bedroom to find the same little boy standing in there, looking up at her and asking for his mom. I heard about that one when I was in middle school. and it always creeped me out. It's always scarier when the adults see them too. Before my own experience, I genuinely thought Steve was just trying to mess with me when he would tell me about these other experiences. Most of our other friends were the same way, thinking Steve was full of it. Even after my own experience at times, I thought I just as easily could have dreamt it up. But then, a few of those same friends, some of them complete non-believers beforehand, had their own experiences, and that changed my whole idea of the house. Once a year, Steve and his family would take a trip and have someone take care of their 2 dogs. One of our mutual friends came over to do just that one day. When she got there that evening to feed the dogs, the house was dark and empty. For some context, the dogs were being fed near the kitchen, and adjacent to the kitchen was the dining room, which led further away into the entryway, and after that, a small living room. Well, not long after feeding the dogs, she heard a blood-curdling scream, a shriek coming from that living room, like someone was inside with her. She booked it outside with the dogs, checked for intruders, and saw that no one was there. I'm pretty sure after that she called Steve, told him what happened, and he laughed and said, "Yeah, stuff like that happens sometimes." A couple of years later, one of the bigger doubters in our group, who thought all of us were full of it, had his own experience. Steve hosted a fair amount of parties back then, and usually we would use his basement to avoid any sort of noise complaints. So all of us were in the basement having a good time, and this particular friend of ours decided to run up and grab another drink from upstairs. Mind you, this friend is not the kind of guy to get completely messed up. He'd only ever have a beer or 2 at most, so for all intents and purposes he was sober. He went up and the ground floor was completely empty as everyone was in the basement. There was a porch directly outside the dining room, and it extended long ways across the back of the house. As our friend was walking into the dining room to grab a beer off the table, he saw a tall, grim-looking woman standing on the porch outside, looking through the window directly at him. He knew something was wrong because she was sort of featureless, and also standing outside by herself, looking inside. He took his eyes off of her for one moment, looked back, and she was gone. A few days later, he told Steve what happened, and Steve told him how he and his siblings had seen that same woman before. Our friend then became a believer. The basement was also creepy as hell, but I can only think of one thing that ever happened down there. It was more of a storage cellar than anything. We still used it for parties and just general hangouts, but it was so cluttered with random things that whole areas of the room were completely cut off. At some point in college, one summer when I was back home, Steve and his family were doing the annual clean-out, and he openly invited some friends to come help. I came one day, and when I got there, Steve's dad nonchalantly told me, "You get to see the secret room." It turned out that in the far corner of the basement, behind a bunch of clutter, there was a little storage closet nobody, besides maybe Steve's parents, knew about. We investigated it that day, and in it, we found a bunch of random old things. I can't remember everything exactly. I don't even know if Steve's family knew what this stuff was, but among all of it, I specifically remember finding this very old-fashioned vintage music box. You know, like the one in The Conjuring with the dancing ballerina. That kind of thing. We decided it was creepy and didn't want anything to do with it, so we left it in that closet. Well, on a different day, when I thankfully was not there, Steve and another friend were cleaning out the basement when suddenly that same music box started playing by itself from behind the door of the closet. They were alone and had not been in that closet all day. They bolted up the stairs. At the top of Steve's house, there were 2 small bedrooms, both belonging to his older sisters. This is the last one I will share, as it's the story that has stuck with me the longest. The second oldest sister once had a vivid and intense dream in which she herself was being exorcised. A demon was being forced out of her as a group of priests were standing over her convulsing body, shouting verses at her, and she remembered it just being crazy intense. After enduring this for some time, she suddenly jolted herself awake, screaming. At that precise moment, a rosary she kept hanging on her wall flew from its place, crashed to the floor, and shattered into a bunch of pieces, completely on its own.
She was covered in sweat and completely terrified. No one else was in the room.